A pleasure to meet all at last, and welcome, once again, to films I'm willing to talk about again. In this instance, right as we are about to get the upcoming sequel to Joker, it's about time that I tackle on one final piece that'll tie the Stuart Little series together. This, of course, is going to be all about Stuart Little 3, The Call of the Wild. Obviously not to be confused with any other things about Call of the Wild or anything related to that. Not anything about the book or even the movie from 2020, which was a while after this film. However, for the most part, I will say that Stuart Little 3 has a lot of differentiation in comparison with the other two films. Mainly the fact that it's not as big as the other films, and because it's animated, it feels much more different. On top of all that, you do have yourself a bit of comprehension. You have not so good reviews and critical ratings, including a 27% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. But apart from all that, I will at least go so far to say, this still does have a lot of enlightenment and enjoyability from my own heart and mind, respectively. But above all things considered, it's still worth mentioning that Stuart Little 3 was not only a big sequel, but it definitely took on an entirely different feel, because this was not at all centered around New York, apart from the opening scene, which apparently takes us on a bit of a journey. Stuart is out there in the wild and apparently encounters a hostile bear. He's able to take it out with his bow and arrow, unlike that little thing that happened with the Falcon, and while he's successful, it's basically just some sort of role play that goes together, a pretend series, if you will. Snowbell lets him know about how to cook the bear and removing the batteries before he does so. However, there was actually a real trip that they were going out into the woods. Yeah, a place known as Lake Garland, where they were going to be spending some time together. A nice little summer where a certain local scout troop system was taking place. And Frederick was determined to have George go on the bonding experience of a lifetime for the little family, and more importantly, to help Stuart learn how to control himself in the wild. And with all the rules and things in play, we are led to a bit of a musical delight set to some credits, a title card and whatnot. Well, when all is said and done, they finally arrive at the campground, find their own little cabin, which unfortunately isn't a great setup, but they do try to make do with what's there. And while Stuart is able to acclimate to many changes, George is more focused on the video games that he's been playing along the entire trip. Determined to make it to level 38 by the end of the summer. And of course, even when other people started to meet up with them, including a girl known by the name of Brooke, it eventually does come to terms that it's not going to be easy. The bonding trip between George, Stuart, and the rest of the Littles, alongside these scout troops that are taking place within Camp Garland itself, still does have a lot of challenges. Basically speaking, you have 3 different scout ribbons: red, blue, and gold. The thing is, you have yourself rookie, intermediate, and exceptional level scouts. And determined scouts of all sorts, of all ages, are set to come through. Frederick is mostly there, leading the group. But of course, you also have a guy known by the name of Mr. Bickle. Yeah, only a step away from being a reference to Rugrats, which are known by the Pickles, not Bickle. So, like I said, there just seems to be some common references to other media by this point. Anyways, though, even though the first day didn't quite go so well for the likes of Stuart and company, he's unfortunately forced to stay at red, because that night when they are at the campfire, they do try to make some amends, and while Mr. Bickle is handing out all of his blue ribbons for the others, Stuart eventually has a little talk with the likes of his father to prove that he can do everything. And even if he's not perfect at it, then he at least knows that he tried his best. But above all that, as the days go on, and as the time spent on the campgrounds continues, and of course with all other things in mind, including a pretty frightened Snowbell, because after all, at some point in the trip, a sandwich is made by the likes of George, Stuart, and there's even a nearby skunk. Yeah, they don't even notice him, as he's basically determined to try to eat the sandwich, while George apparently does instead. But of course, Brooke comes along in her canoe and talks a little bit with George and Stuart, even telling them that there is the legend of a certain beast within the campgrounds. A beast whom could supposedly smell blood 5 miles away, and apparently it likes to eat cats. This of course does frighten Snowbell a bit, and it eventually gets so bad he ends up going underneath the cabin that they were staying. And it's apparently a funny prank that Monty set up. Yeah, Monty followed them to Camp Garland by sleeping in the trunk of the car, of all things considered. But in any case though, even though Stuart doesn't do such a great job at the activities, we can at least think about the fact that Mr. Bickle is going to give him some good credit, knowing that he tried his best. I mean, Stuart shot an arrow at a flower, and also didn't do such a good job with handling the ropes, or even tying knots. But let's be real here. Nobody's really perfect at that. Other series of any sorts, like Up, Charlie Brown, and whatnot, give out the classic Boy Scout vibe. The one who's basically singled out. But even still, has things that the other scouts don't. But yet, we do have yet to see what Stuart can do differently than the rest of the scouts. This basically all acclimates to one major plot point that turns us all around in a way we didn't expect. Because there comes a time where Mr. Bickle plans on taking the entire group deep into the woods, touring them on various things, helping them to learn about the wild, including the animals that occupy it, the many plant species, trees, and structures that were made by animals, including beehives, beaver dams, etc. However, this all comes to a point where a so-called buddy system was implemented, and even though Stuart had tried his best to piece himself together and find a buddy of his, it never truly came to that. But of course, one major rule was set upon through the group itself. Mr. Bickle taught them that if they got lost in the woods, they're pretty much goners. Obviously, that was a joke, yeah, even though it didn't really seem like it was at first. Frederick does interfere, telling them that all they gotta do is hug a tree until they find them. Seems simple enough, right? If you get lost or separated from the group, which of course would have gone against Martha's rules that were placed upon Stuart at the start of the film, where he was to not go wandering or get lost in the woods. Even George went upon to tell Stuart that if he never goes into the woods, he obviously can't get lost. But since they were doing just that, that's the biggest change that we've come to know about. All this talk about going into the woods and deep into the forest, unknowingly allowing Stuart to get lost, as he becomes stranded in the middle of nowhere, unable to find his way back. And of course he does take advantage of the rule that was implied, to hug a tree until the others find him. For a while it actually goes unnoticed, believe it or not, because the thing is, even though Stuart was with the group for some time, they didn't realize that Stuart had actually strayed off, accidentally. Yeah, but even then, Stuart was thankfully able to get some help. Not by the scouts, but by the same skunk that we saw earlier. Yeah, I bet you didn't know there were a bunch of talking animals in the woods just as well. There are a few different moments where we do cut to these animals, but now is where it starts to become more clear. The skunk, known by the name of Rico, played by Wayne Brady, actually sets out to assist Stuart on his journey back home, and more importantly, to reunite with the rest of the scouts, as eventually things do start to take a turn in a different direction. As Mr. Bickle messes about with an old beehive, and while the others manage to get out of there, he unfortunately is not so lucky. Rico and Stuart actually catch on to him being stung repeatedly, and it's kind of a laughing stock matter for Rico especially. Of course, there was basically some supplies that Stuart had in his bag, including some salt and pepper, mostly if they were going to have some food, as well as a chocolate for later, which Rico ends up stealing from him, eating in front of him. But eventually things don't get any better, because they unfortunately are hit by a certain threat. And even though they manage to get out of there by diving into a hole, it really becomes clear we are about to have an even bigger threat than the likes of the cats or the falcon. Yeah, that so-called legend of the beast that Brooke had mentioned earlier in the film was apparently becoming more and more apparent by this point. And it all eventually boils down to the fact that after all the troubles that Stuart had gone through with the scouts, they eventually find out that Stuart apparently had wandered off from the group somehow, and eventually try to organize a search party in order to find him and bring him back. Meanwhile, there are all the troubles that took place with the beast eventually showing up. It's apparently a female lion, or lioness, as some might imply. And much like with the other main antagonists here, we do have somebody who basically uses others to benefit herself. In this case, you have Virginia Madsen voicing the iconic Beast character. And compared to that of the cats or the falcon, whom attacked Stuart and his family before, we have something even more incredible here to deal with. And it's not just the fact that Stuart and Rico were there, but we also get Snowbell in on the action, because he also gets tangled in this whole mess. Well, when the scouts, including Mr. Bickle and Frederick and George, do formulate a plan to go after Stuart in an attempt to find him and recover him, they eventually stumble across Stuart, whom was actually able to defeat the beast. Yeah, there was a point where they get cornered. Snowbell had gotten captured at one point, and salt and pepper were sprayed on the beast, causing her to sneeze and fall off the cliff of her own lair into the water below. So, packing quite a punch, much like how Frederick implied that earlier in the film. Yeah, there's a lot of callbacks that we do get to see that seem painfully obvious when you think about things. All the stuff that's considerable enough. Anyways though, one final plan is enacted. When the beast ends up coming back from the water below, there eventually was a trap that she discovers was right in front of her. And just when you thought that the plan wasn't going to go smoothly, eventually, we see Rico and the rest of the animals, including a bear, a beaver, and others, team up against the likes of the beast. They're all ganging up on her, and it becomes quickly reminiscent of the ending of The Lion King, when the hyenas found out that they were thrown under the bus, and as a result, rebel against Scar, ending him once and for all. The same thing happens here, with the beast getting defeated in the form of getting captured, basically. It's kind of like what Stuart himself visualized. If a beast were to attack him, he'd kick him or tie him up. And well, that's basically what happens here. He not only kicked the beast's butt, he basically tied her. So, talk about some foreshadowing here in addition to all these callbacks. So, I can see why some critics were not a big fan of this film in conjunction to the other two films. But in any case though, the beast does get taken away by helicopter, while Stuart is safely returned back to the campground. And the cabin itself eventually is emptied as the summer draws to a close, and all this time that was spent out there with those scouts eventually boils down to Stuart becoming an exceptional member of Camp Garland's Scout Club. He receives his golden bandana on his outfit. And just like that, we have an epic return home. Just like that, that's the ending of a trilogy right then and there. History made in less than 7 years. With 3 films, 2 of which being live action, 1 being animated, and having all these different actors come around. It has similarities to that of other well-known franchises, like Sharknado, for instance, which had tons of fantastic actors that we got from over the years. But let's be real though, we've had lots to look forward to regarding the situations that Stuart has been through. And with all the other things that have been dealt with, all the creatures he's faced, it really comes to show, what could he have possibly faced against after the beast? I mean, cats, a falcon, and a lioness. What could he have faced against next? Well, there never was a Stuart Little 4 because of the poor ratings that have been put upon Stuart Little 3. But my overall rating on this one, while it is somewhat inagreeable, terms with most critics. I'm mostly at a 6.6 out of 10.1. So while it's not a great film by all means, it still does a great job at being a Stuart Little film. A film that has in fact been made possible thanks to the visions that Columbia put together in an effort to not only adapt from a well-known book, but also expand upon it in many different ways. I mean, you got Stuart fighting against several types of animals, the likes of which that would have easily murdered a mouse, or even multiple, at the same time. A lion would have definitely torn hundreds of mice apart in a swift slash from their claws. But in this instance, this lion definitely is a bit of a joke. And likely in a good way too. So overall, this is just how I see all three of these movies. And now that I have wrapped up yet another good series of movies, it's about time that I get going to the theaters again. Because after all these movies I've seen, in theaters and otherwise, I feel like I might need a break from all this. However, not quite done yet. I still want to make a lot more of this content possible for the likes of this series. So, of course, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, follow me wherever you can find me, and stay on the Hollywood side for more of this stuff.
I want you, but I don't have you yet. I ain't got no tricks to be playing on you.